Lately, I've been on the hunt for a good React UI library. To me, that means that it looks good, is accessible, and compatible with the NextJS App Router and React Server components, because if it can work there, it can work in any web-based setup. And I think I found a really good one. It's Radix Themes. Radix Themes is built on top of Radix by the creators of Radix. And if you don't know what Radix is, it's a headless, accessible UI library that sits underneath some very popular UI frameworks, most notably ShadCN. Radix Themes is just the Radix team saying, you know what, we can do the skin components thing too, and it's really good. They've got a theme configurable demo with all the components, and it's everything you need to build your basic app. Buttons, selects, dialogues, layout, grids, all of it, and it all looks great. So to try out Radix Themes, we're going to be building this Pokemon deck builder application. It's written with the NextJS App Router. I'm going to walk you all the way through it from tip to tail, and of course, all the code is free to you in the link in the description right down below. It's got database access, server actions, API routes, the whole app setup, and it's even authenticated using the super easy to use AuthKit from WorkOS. And WorkOS is the sponsor of this week's video. WorkOS is an enterprise-grade auth provider that focuses on B2B SaaS applications. They've got SCIM and SSO support, as well as SOC 2 compliance. And if you know what all those acronyms mean, I think you're going to be very happy with their service. They have an amazingly generous free tier. They also are the folks behind Radix and Radix Themes. So a huge shout out to them for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video. All right, let's go build ourselves a Pokemon deck builder app. All right, over in the terminal, we're going to use create next app to build Radix Pokemon. I'm going to use TypeScript, ESLint. I am not going to use Tailwind CSS. Radix Themes is not built on top of Tailwind CSS. Source directory, app router, of course, and I'm not going to change the import alias. And now I'll bring it up in VS Code. Okay, now the first thing we're going to do is install Radix Themes in our application. So let's go take a look at how to do that. And this is the Radix Themes install page. Of course, there's a link to that in the description right down below. Let's just start off by installing Radix UI Themes. All right, with that done, the next thing we want to do is bring in the styles to our layout. Now I'm going to keep the global CSS file, but I am going to do a little bit of a reset. I'm just going to take the underline off anchor links. And I'm going to reset padding and margin on the body. Now the next thing we need to do is wrap our app in a theme provider. So I'll bring in the theme provider as well as a container. That's going to give us a nice kind of layout container. And then I'll wrap our app in that theme provider. So I'll come down here to where I have our children, and I'll wrap that in theme. And then within that, I'll put that in a container. Okay, now over on our home page, I'm just going to go and remove pretty much everything here. Then I'm going to bring in heading from Radix Themes and put in there Pokemon Deck Builder just to see what it looks like. Let's give it a try. All right, looking pretty good, but I want to do it in dark mode, so let's change it over to dark mode. To do that, I just need to go over to my theme and set my default appearance to dark. And now it's in dark mode. So easy. Now, if you notice, both page and layout are both still React Server components. I haven't had to do any client stuff. The components that are non-interactive are completely compatible with RSCs, and I haven't had to go and take the theme provider and wrap that in a use client like I have to with other libraries. This library just works right out of the box with the NextJS App Router, and I love that. All right, let's go build ourselves a header at the top of the page, and that's going to allow me to show you a little bit more about how layout is done in this model. So I'm going to create a new header file inside of components. I'm going to specify components as the directory, and then slash, and then header.tsx. That actually creates a components directory and then header within that. And inside that, I'm going to bring box and flex in addition to heading. We just saw heading from before. Now, box and flex are two layout components. Box essentially wraps div, and it gives us things like P. That will give us padding. You can do like PT for padding top. You can also do M for margin, in this case, MB3 for margin at bottom of 3. And then flex is a wrapper around flexbox. Now, having looked at a whole bunch of different UI libraries and also how Tailwind integrates, it's interesting to see how different libraries handle layout. This is a very common pattern. You've got box and flex and grid and basically layout components that help you lay everything out, as opposed to using Tailwind classes. It's just a different way of thinking about layout. If you like components, I think this one is going to appeal to you. All right, so as we can see, I'm bringing in this header module CSS. That doesn't exist yet, so let me add that. And I'll define a header class, but I'm not going to put anything in there at the moment. Over here, we can see that I'm accessing that on styles.header. I'm going to add a little bit. Let's go take a look at where I'm going to add that. So I'm going to bring that into the page. And I'm going to put it at the top. Okay, it looks pretty good. But now I want to give it a little bit more snappy background as well as a shadow. So let's go add on to that CSS. And I'm going to use background with var accent 5. Now, accent 5 is actually defined by Radix themes as an accent color, and it's related to the theme. So when you change the theme color, then the accent color changes. So this is really cool. You'll get to see this in just a little bit as we change out the theme. So take a look at our app. We can see, yep, now we got this nice kind of light blue accent. Now I'm going to give it some border radiuses on the bottom. Again, I'm going to use variables defined by Radix themes, as well as some margin on the left and right. And that's with these spacing variables also created by Radix themes. And then I'm going to put a little box shadow on this to give it a nice little shadow at the bottom. All right, looks good. And the shadow is colored a very light blue, which is, of course, dependent on the accent, which is dependent on the theme. Now, to make this all the more apparent, I'm going to go and bring in one of the coolest components I've seen, and that's over here in the layout. I'm going to bring in theme panel. Then I can put inside my theme panel. Hit save. This is so cool. And we get a theme panel on the side. How cool is that? Now I can go and change the theme, and you can see that accent color changing as I click, and how easy was that? So if you are working with a designer and you want to know kind of what is our stock theme going to be, then you can use this theme panel and just play around with it. You can change the appearance from light to dark. You can change the radius on buttons. You can change the scaling. So many things you can do. All right, now that we have our basic app kind of set up, before we start actually building out our Pokemon deck builder, we have to know who you are. So let's handle authentication so we can handle people logging in, and then we can build out the database that it has user ID specific data in it. Because as we're building out our Pokemon decks, we want them to be user specific. So what are we going to use that? Well, we're going to use AuthKit. Now, AuthKit is one integration path with WorkOS. It is very easy to integrate with a NextJS application. So this is what we're going to use in this case. To use that, I'm going to go back over to my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to stop the server. I'm going to add in the AuthKit Next.js from WorkOS. Now I need to set up my environment variables. So I'm going to go create a new file locally called .env.development.local. Let me get rid of a few files here. Now there's 4 environment variables we need to add. There is a redirect URI that is for the callback in our app that's going to get any callback from the auth service. There's a cookie password. That is a unique string that we get to put together. A lot of folks use OpenSSL for this. They do this OpenSSL ran to create a unique string. I'm going to pipe that through PB copy. That's just going to put it in the paste buffer and just paste it in there. And then I need my client ID and API key. So to get that, I'm going to go over to WorkOS. I've already logged in there. So I'm going to go over to my dashboard, and then you can see that I have 2 variables here, WorkOS client ID and WorkOS API key. I'm going to go copy and paste those in my environment variables. You don't get to see those, but all you need to do is log in, get yourself onto the dashboard, and you'll have access to them too. All right, I've added both of those. Next thing I need to do is define some middleware. So I'm going to go and create a middleware.ts file in the source directory, not the source app directory. Then I'm going to bring in the AuthKit middleware. I'm going to configure it to say what routes are actually given authorization information. That would be /. And then once we get into the deck details pages /deck, and then anything inside that. Now, once we have the middleware configured, we need to go create that callback route. So I'm going to go over here to our app. I'm going to create a new directory called callback. And then within that, a route handler. And that is it. All you need is handle auth from AuthKit Next.js. And then you just export get, which would be the get method of this route, with handle auth and then the return path name. So when somebody's logged in, we want them to go back to / having been logged in. Okay, so now let's go back over to page, and I'm going to bring in some functions from AuthKit. Those include the get sign in URL as well as get user. So what we want to do is we want to find out, are you logged in? If you're not logged in, we want to give you a button so you can log in. So let's find out if you're logged in. We do that by awaiting get user. Now, of course, we need to be an async function to use await. So now we know if you're logged in as a user or not. Now, assuming you're not logged in, we need to give you a URL. So we'll get the sign in URL by awaiting that get sign in URL. Now, if you are signed in, we want to show you that header as well as the Pokemon deck builder. If you're not logged in, we want to show a panel that has a sign in button. So I'm going to bring in a few more components from themes, including text, box, button, and card. And then we're going to switch based on user here. So we are logged in, then we're going to have a user, and we'll want to show the header and the heading. If we're not logged in, we're going to want to show you some UI that allows you to log in. To do that, we'll create a card that has a box inside of it, and eventually, down at the bottom, has an anchor tag for signing in with that sign-in URL. All right, let's go fire up our app and take a look. All right, looking good. So now let's sign in. Now I can either use an email address for this by creating my own users, or I can use a social login. I'm just going to use a social login in this case. And now I'm logged in. How cool is that? But am I logged in? Let's go take a look. So I'm going to go use user here. And since I know I have it, I'm going to put in user.firstname as well as user.lastname. And there we go. Looking good. I'm logged in. That's great. So now let's go and add a little bit of UI to the header to show who you are, show your avatar, and then allow you to log out. So I'm going to get rid of this, and then I'm going to go back into our header. I'm going to bring in avatar and button from Radix themes, as well as from AuthKit, get user and sign out. Of course, we know what get user is. That gets the user, and sign out gives us our sign out action. So let's get our user, and then where we have this flex box at the end, I'm going to replace that with one that says, if we're a user, then we're going to show the avatar, as well as have a form where we give it a server action that signs us out if we click on it, and a sign out button. Let's hit save. And now we can see that we got our avatar plus our sign out button, and we can start even changing our radius on that. This is just so cool. I'm in love with this. This is awesome. All right, let's sign out. Sign back in. Doesn't get much easier than that. Now it's time to start building out the core of our deck building application. So you can see how to integrate this with a SQL database and how to do server actions and all of that. So the first thing I want to do is build a database for us. So I'm going to use SQLite for that. To do that, I'm going to bring in libsql client. And then we need to define a schema. So I'm going to go over here in the source directory, create a new folder called db, and in that setup.sql, this is going to set up our database for us. And it'll just be some simple SQL. We're going to drop any tables if they exist, and then we're going to recreate some tables, one for decks and one for cards. So you're going to have a decks table that then has a one-to-many relationship with cards. The key element here is user ID. We're going to use the user ID from AuthKit to index into our list of decks. All right, so let's go build our local DB file. To do that, we use SQLite 3 to create the local DB, which doesn't exist yet. And then we initialize that using that SQL script that we just set up. All right, the next thing we want to do is create some TypeScript functions that allow us to manage this database. Add decks, add cards to a deck, remove decks, all that kind of fun stuff. So to do that, we're going to create an index file in here. And we're going to bring in a whole mess of functions. Now, the key points are here that one, we have this whole module wrapped in use server. That means that any exported async function out of here is going to be a server action. Next key point is that we're going to use create client from that libsql client to connect to that local DB file. Now, you could use an environment variable for this. So when you're in production, you might want to point it at Terso, for example. Terso uses exactly this same libsql client. So this is essentially just the local version of what you'd have if you were developing with Terso. We're going to bring in get user from that AuthKit Next.js. Next, we create some types that we're going to use throughout our system, most importantly, like Pokemon. And then we've got a whole mess of server action functions like add Pokemon, remove Pokemon, and then the all-important create deck. Now, what create deck is going to do is create a deck for us. And that's the first thing we need to do in our application. So we're going to need to get the user. If the user doesn't exist, we're going to want to throw. And if there is a user, then we're going to want to insert into that deck's table our new deck. Okay, now let's go and create the UI to build a deck. So I'm going to go back over here into our source. I'm going to create a new directory called components, and in there, deck creator. This is going to be a client component because it handles state. And we're going to bring in our kind of form basics like text field, as well as button, and of course the flex layout system. So what we have layout-wise is a row-based flex layout. It's got that text field in it. That's a wrapper around the input field that just gives you that really nice looking Radix UI, plus that headless accessibility. And then you've got a button that says create a new deck. You can even hit enter on that input and it'll create a new deck for you, or you can hit this button that says create a new deck. So let's bring that into our homepage. So we'll bring in our deck creator and put it right up at the top there and launch our app. And there we go. We've got our deck building control. Let's go and name it first deck. Create a new deck. Okay, but how do we know it worked? Well, let's go over to our Visual Studio Code, create a new terminal, bring up that SQLite 3 on that local DB, and we'll just do a select against it. So we selected the name from decks, and we see that we have first deck. So awesome, that's great. Now that we know it works, let's go bring it into the UI. So on our homepage, we're going to want to get the decks of the current user. That's the get decks function. And we'll simply await that down here. Now, if we're logged out, it's just going to return a empty array. So this is fine when it comes to logged out behavior. Now we want to give a list of our decks. So to do that, we create a flex box that wraps a bunch of cards. Each card has in it the deck name, as well as all of the cards. Now we need to bring in some more components for this. We need to bring in flex. We also want to bring in link from next, because down here we have a link wrapping each one of our decks. And that would go to the deck info page, which we'll build in just a second. Let's hit save. Awesome. So now we can see we have our first deck. And if we click on this, then we go to our deck details, which doesn't actually have anything yet. Okay, so we want to go and create this deck page. And we want that to be authenticated. In fact, we want any authenticated route to have that header on the top that allows us to sign out. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a route group called authenticated. Now, route groups are indicated by these parentheses. So we're putting parentheses around route groups. Now, what route groups allow you to do is have layouts specific to that route group, but that route group does not appear as part of the URL. So, for example, I put in deck and then ID and page.tsx, then the actual URL for this is going to be /deck/ID, not this authenticated. So that authenticated just kind of disappears and leaves us with the page. Now I do want to take advantage of this nested layout functionality. So I'm going to create a new layout inside of authenticated, which applies to all the authenticated routes. And we'll call that layout.tsx. And then we create an authenticated layout that brings in that header and just puts that header on top of any page that's inside of this authenticated route group. All right, let's go take a look at page. And we'll start off by simply getting the deck and putting its name up. Hit save. And now we can see that deck 1 has the header, which means that that nested layout has been applied automatically. And it tells us the name of the deck, in this case, first deck. Now I do want to make sure that only you can see your decks. We'll bring in get user and await that. And then if the deck's user ID doesn't match my user ID, then we want to say that this is not found. Okay, looks good. And of course, I own my first deck, so that's not a problem. Now to start adding cards, we need to first create a Pokemon card that displays a Pokemon. So in our components, I'll create a new Pokemon card. This Pokemon card component is going to take a Pokemon as well as some options to either show an add button or a remove button. So adding and removing allows us to add and remove items from the deck, and those just toggle this add button that uses the add Pokemon server action, and then this remove button that uses that remove button server action. Now we want to use this Pokemon card component in a Pokemon grid layout. This Pokemon grid component takes a list of Pokemon as well as that show and add, and it basically just wraps those in a Radix themes grid container. This is really nice. Check this out. That columns, that allows you to do responsive layout in a grid super easily. We can say that we want 4 items in the small layout, 5 in the medium layout. Just really nice. All right, looks good. Now let's bring that into our page and use it to display our deck. Now, of course, we don't know what the Pokemon are. So where would we find a database of Pokemon? Well, turns out there's the Poke API. So I've got a set of helper functions that allow us to connect to this REST-based Pokemon API service. And let's put those at the top of our application so we can build a search box that allows us to find the different Pokemon. So back up in source, I'm going to create a new file, pokemon.ts. And that's going to be a handy set of Pokemon functions, including, most importantly, this get full Pokemon, which allows us to search that API of Pokemon. Now we're going to wrap that in a search handler. So I'm going to go back into this authenticated route, and I'm going to create a search Pokemon directory, and then inside of that route.ts. And that route handler is going to export a get route that then takes the search parameter Q and calls that get full Pokemon with that Q to find any Pokemon that match that query. So to leverage that API, I'm going to create a new search list component. This search list has a query input at the top, as well as a list of Pokemon that it found that you can add. So we're going to give it an initial set of Pokemon so that it looks like it has something to start with. And then we're going to also give it the deck, the existing Pokemon. And that allows us to say, well, hey, don't actually show anything that's already in the deck. Okay, well, let's just try this out and I can show you. So bring it in a page. And then we'll bring it in below Pokemon Grid. Now we know we have the list of Pokemon that we currently have, so we put those in there, but we don't have a initial set of Pokemon, so let's go and do that. To get that, we'll just bring in get full Pokemon from our handy Pokemon library, and then we'll invoke that. That'll give us the top 10 Pokemon, and that looks good. Okay, let's try it out. Okay, well, it looks like it found stuff because it's giving us this invalid source prop. Now, what this is telling us is that we're trying to show images, because we want to show the images of the Pokemon, from raw.githubusercontent.com. Now, by default, if you use NextJS image tags, which you should if you're using NextJS, it needs to know all of the valid domains where those images come from. So let's go back over here to our next configuration and then specify that any images coming from that URL are okay. Let's try it out. And there we go. How cool is that? Let's add a couple of Pokemon. Awesome. This is looking great. Now let's go back to our homepage. And we can see, well, we don't have any cards there, so let's reuse that Pokemon Grid to show the cards in that deck. So go back to our homepage, bring in our grid, and then instead of cards here, we use our Pokemon Grid, slice off the top 5 cards, and there we go. All right, there you have it, a full Pokemon deck building app. It's built on NextJS, it's database driven, it's authenticated, and it's brought to you by our good friends over at WorkOS, who not only make AuthKit, this fantastically easy way, as you've seen, to integrate authentication into your app, but also they make the open source Radix and Radix themes library that you just saw for building out awesome, accessible UIs. Now, if you want to help support this channel, support our sponsors. Head on over to AuthKit and WorkOS. Check them out for yourselves. There's links in the description right down below. In the meantime, of course, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to put that in the comment section right down below. Did you like the example? Are you going to try building this for yourself? Let me know in the comments right down below. And you can help me out by clicking on that like button, clicking on the subscribe button if you really like the video, and of course, ringing that bell so that you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.